for the Shang Dynasty.
Destroy our enemies!
For the Queen!
Forward!
The first general of China was a woman, Fu Hao. In 1976, the earth near Anyang, China, gave up a secret that shattered 3,000 years of history. Archaeologists excavating the ruins of the ancient Shang Dynasty stumbled upon a miracle, a royal tomb that had never been looted. As they cleared away the soil, they expected to find the remains of a prince or a court official. Instead, they found massive bronze battle axes, weapons of war weighing nearly 20 pounds each, designed for a commander of immense physical strength. And inscribed on the bronze was a name that would force the world to rewrite the history of warfare: Fu Hao. The occupant of tomb number 5 was not just a queen. She was a military warlord. Lying amidst the jade and the gore of ancient sacrifice was the woman who had served as the first general of China. For millennia, historians believed the battlefields of the Bronze Age were the exclusive domain of men. But Fu Hao's tomb proved that long before the legends of Mulan, a real woman had commanded China's earliest armies, presided over its bloodiest rituals, and held the power of life and death over an empire. Before we reveal the full story of this warrior queen, if you appreciate history that uncovers the forgotten commanders of the ancient world, please take a moment to subscribe and like this video. And let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. We're fascinated to see how far these stories of defiance are reaching. To understand the magnitude of Fu Hao's existence, we must travel back to the very dawn of Chinese civilization, the Shang Dynasty, around 1250 BC. This was not the China of silk robes and Confucian order. This was the Bronze Age, a time of myth, terror, and constant, brutal warfare. It was an era where the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the spirits was terrifyingly thin, and where the king ruled not just by decree, but by divination. The Shang Dynasty dominated the Yellow River Valley, the cradle of civilization. But their existence was precarious. They were a sophisticated society, capable of casting massive bronze vessels and building great cities. Yet they were surrounded on all sides by hostile tribes: the Fang to the north, the Qiang to the west, and the Yi to the south. These barbarians, as the Shang called them, were constantly probing the borders, raiding settlements, and threatening to extinguish the light of this early empire. Survival required constant vigilance and ruthless military action. In this volatile world sat King Wu Ding, one of the most successful and long-reigning monarchs of the Shang. History remembers him as a restorer of the dynasty, a king who expanded the borders and solidified Shang power. But the dragon bones, the thousands of oracle bones used for divination, reveal that Wu Ding's success was not achieved alone. Time and again, when the state faced its direst threats, the king did not turn to his brothers or his court officials. He turned to his wife, Fu Hao. The oracle bones are the primary historical record of this era, and they paint a picture of a woman who possessed an authority that rivaled the king himself. These are not poetic legends written centuries later. They are contemporary administrative records. They ask the spirits critical questions. Will Fu Hao gather soldiers? Will Fu Hao be victorious? And should Fu Hao lead the campaign against the Fang? The answer, preserved in the cracked bone, was almost always yes. In a society that was becoming increasingly patriarchal, Fu Hao broke every mold. She stepped out of the palace and onto the chariot. She did not just hold a title. She held the Yue, the great ritual battle axe that symbolized the power to kill. Her tomb contained over 130 weapons, dagger axes, arrowheads, and bows, proving she was a frontline commander who likely fought hand to hand or directed the slaughter from the thick of the fighting. She was a woman of duality. On one hand, she was a mother and a wife, deeply connected to the king, bearing his children and managing his massive household. On the other, she was a terrifying entity on the battlefield, a general who could summon 13,000 soldiers, the largest standing army of the era, to her banner. She presided over gruesome rituals and commanded the deaths of thousands of enemies. She was the ultimate partner to Wu Ding, his sword and his shield. Her rise to power is even more extraordinary when we consider the context of the Shang court. Wu Ding had over 60 consorts. Most were political alliances, women sent from neighboring tribes to secure peace. They lived in the palace, performed minor rituals, and largely disappeared from history. Fu Hao was different. She did not just live in the palace. She owned land, she collected taxes, and she maintained her own troops. The atmosphere of the Shang court where she rose was thick with the smoke of incense and the smell of roasting meat from sacrificial fires. It was a theocratic state, where the king served as the bridge between the people and the high god, Dai. Every decision, from the harvest to the deployment of troops, was determined by the cracking of the oracle bones in the heat of the fire. In this spiritual and political pressure cooker, Fu Hao emerged not just as a military leader, but as a high priestess and a master of the supernatural. But who was she before she became the king's favorite general? How did she navigate the treacherous politics of a crowded harem to become the one person the king trusted with his life and his empire? To understand her rise, we must look at the unique structure of the Shang military and the extraordinary trust King Wu Ding placed in her, a trust that would be tested in the fires of the greatest war the Shang had ever fought. To understand how Fu Hao became a general, we must first discard our modern assumptions about ancient Chinese queens. In later centuries, imperial consorts were often confined to the inner court, their lives strictly regulated by protocol, their feet bound, and their influence limited to whispers in the emperor's ear. But the Shang Dynasty was a different world entirely. It was a raw, feudal society where power was not given. It was taken and held by force. And in this brutal environment, Fu Hao did not just survive the politics of King Wu Ding's court. She dominated them. King Wu Ding was a monarch of immense appetite and ambition. To cement alliances with the fractious tribes surrounding his kingdom, he married over 60 women. In such a crowded harem, a single consort could easily vanish into obscurity, becoming nothing more than a name on a genealogical list. Most of these women were political hostages in all but name, living in the capital to ensure the loyalty of their fathers. But Fu Hao was not content to be a passive observer of history. She rose to become one of the king's 3 primary consorts, but unlike her rivals, her power did not derive solely from the king's affection. It derived from her own independence. The oracle bones reveal a startling fact that sets Fu Hao apart from almost every other royal woman in Chinese history. She was a landowner. She did not merely reside in the royal palace at Anyang. She possessed her own personal fiefdom outside the capital. This was not a garden estate for leisure. It was a functioning political and economic unit. She governed her own territory, collected her own taxes, and, crucially, controlled her own population. In the feudal structure of the Shang, land meant resources, and resources meant soldiers. This economic independence was the foundation of her military career. When Fu Hao rode to war, she did not always rely on the king to provide her with troops. She often mobilized men from her own estates, peasants who owed their allegiance directly to her. This gave her a degree of autonomy that was virtually unheard of. She was not just the king's wife, she was a feudal lord in her own right, a partner who brought her own assets to the marriage. This dynamic created a relationship with Wu Ding that was less like a monarch and a subject, and more like two warlords joining forces. But land and wealth were only half of the equation. In the Shang Dynasty, the right to rule was inextricably linked to the spirit world. The Shang people believed that the world was governed by a hierarchy of ancestors and gods, with the supreme deity, Di, at the top. Warfare was not just a matter of strategy. It was a ritual act, a form of human sacrifice on a massive scale to appease the powers above. To command an army, one had to command the spirits. Here, Fu Hao's influence was perhaps even more terrifying than her military might. She was a high priestess, a medium who could bridge the gap between the living and the dead. The inscriptions show that Wu Ding frequently entrusted her with the most sacred and politically sensitive task of the state, conducting the oracle bone divinations and presiding over sacrificial rituals. This was a role of immense political weight. By interpreting the cracks in the burnt bone, Fu Hao had the power to legitimize military campaigns, determine the timing of harvests, and interpret the will of the ancestors. In the eyes of the Shang soldiers, she was not just a commander giving orders. She was a conduit for the divine. When she raised the massive bronze battle axe, she was acting with the sanction of the gods. This spiritual authority was likely the key to her ability to command male generals and hardened soldiers. They weren't just obeying a woman. They were obeying a high priestess who held the keys to their spiritual survival. The relationship between Wu Ding and Fu Hao, preserved in the fragmented sentences of the oracle bones, offers a rare, intimate glimpse into a Bronze Age marriage. It was a partnership of profound trust and, surprisingly, deep affection. The king did not just ask the spirits about her military victories. He asked about her health with an obsessive frequency. Will Fu Hao's toothache improve? Is Fu Hao's pregnancy going well? Will Fu Hao be safe from illness? These questions reveal a king who was deeply dependent on his queen. He needed her healthy, and he needed her strong. When the Shang state was threatened by the relentless raids of the Fang tribe to the north, Wu Ding realized that his own generals were insufficient. The Fang were a persistent, existential threat, a nomadic confederation that struck quickly and vanished before the heavy Shang chariots could respond. The empire was bleeding from 1,000 cuts, and the morale of the army was fracturing. It was in this moment of crisis that Fu Hao stepped forward. She did not wait to be asked. The oracle bones record that it was Fu Hao who approached the king and volunteered to lead a campaign. The entry reads, "Fu Hao instructs, muster soldiers at Pang." She was taking the initiative, using her own authority to organize a counteroffensive. Wu Ding, however, was cautious. He did not immediately agree. He consulted the oracle bones repeatedly, asking the ancestors if it was wise to send his wife into the grinder of the northern frontier. Should Fu Hao lead the army? If Fu Hao attacks the Fang, will she receive divine blessing? The spirits answered with a resounding yes. Armed with her own troops, the sanction of the king, and the blessing of the ancestors, Fu Hao prepared to leave her estate and march north. She donned the heavy armor of a Shang commander, likely a helmet of bronze and leather, and a tunic reinforced with lacquered plates. She stepped onto her war chariot, a two-wheeled vehicle of destruction pulled by 2 horses with a driver and an archer at her side. She was no longer just a landowner or a priestess. She was now the vanguard of the Shang Empire. The woman who had managed the king's household was about to demonstrate that she could manage a slaughter. The two Fang had terrorized the northern borders for generations, but they had never faced an enemy like Fu Hao. She was bringing a new kind of warfare to the Bronze Age, disciplined, strategic, and utterly ruthless. The rise of the queen was complete. The legend of the general was about to begin. To truly appreciate Fu Hao as a general, we must strip away the modern image of warfare and immerse ourselves in the brutal reality of the Bronze Age. War in 1250 BC was not fought with maps drawn in command tents or with radio communications. It was a chaotic, visceral collision of metal and flesh, governed by the limitations of supply lines and the terror of close-quarters combat. When Fu Hao rode north to confront the two Fang, she was not just leading a raiding party. She was commanding a logistical machine of unprecedented scale. The oracle bones record a specific campaign where Fu Hao commanded 13,000 soldiers. To the modern ear, 13,000 might sound like a modest division, but in the context of the 13th century BC, this was a leviathan. This was likely the largest military force ever assembled on the East Asian continent, up to that point in history. For comparison, most tribal skirmishes of the era involved a few hundred men. A great battle might involve 1,000. Fu Hao was moving a force that was effectively a moving city, requiring tons of grain, fodder for horses, and a complex hierarchy of officers to maintain discipline. The logistical feat alone qualifies her as a genius of administration. To feed and equip 13,000 men required the mobilization of the entire Shang agricultural base. It meant conscripting peasants from the fields, securing bronze from the foundries for thousands of weapons, and coordinating the movement of supply wagons over rough, roadless terrain. That Fu Hao could sustain such a force in the field suggests she possessed an intellect that was as administrative as it was martial. She wasn't just a warrior. She was a master of logistics, the silent engine of war that wins campaigns before the first arrow is fired. The core of her striking power was the chariot. By the time of the Shang, the war chariot had arrived from the steppes of Central Asia and had been adapted into the tank of the ancient Chinese battlefield. These were heavy, two-wheeled vehicles drawn by 2 or 4 horses, carrying a driver, an archer, and a spearman, or, in Fu Hao's case, the commander wielding the battle axe. Standing atop a chariot required immense physical strength and balance. As the vehicle thundered over uneven ground at full gallop, Fu Hao would have been the most visible target on the battlefield. The psychological impact of seeing a queen, armored and armed, leading the charge from the vanguard cannot be overstated. In an era where leadership was physical, her presence at the front was a rallying cry that turned frightened conscripts into fanatical warriors. But her army was not just chariots. The bulk of her 13,000 troops were infantry, equipped with the signature weapon of the Shang Dynasty, the ji, or dagger axe. This was a cruel, versatile weapon, a bronze blade mounted perpendicular to a long wooden shaft. It was designed to hook enemies, drag them from their chariots, or cleave through the skulls of infantrymen. The violence was intimate and horrific. There was no killing from a distance with artillery. Victory required closing the distance and hacking the enemy to pieces. Her enemy, the two Fang, were formidable in their own right. They were likely a semi-nomadic people, masters of guerrilla warfare who refused to fight in the open, disciplined formations that favored the heavy Shang chariots. They struck at supply lines, burned villages, and vanished into the hills. Fighting them was like fighting smoke. Traditional Shang generals had struggled against them for generations because they tried to chase them. Fu Hao, however, brought a new strategic concept to the war: coordination and entrapment. The oracle bones reveal that Fu Hao did not fight alone. She operated as part of a synchronized dual command with King Wu Ding. This is where her military legacy truly shines. She is credited with executing the earliest recorded ambush in Chinese history. The target was the Fang, allies of the two Fang who had joined the war against the Shang. A typical commander would have marched the entire army to meet the Fang head-on, resulting in a bloody, unpredictable clash. Fu Hao and Wu Ding devised a different plan, a strategy of deception and patience known as the pincer movement. The plan required absolute precision and trust. King Wu Ding would lead his forces in a direct, noisy assault against the Fang, drawing their attention and their anger. He would feign weakness, or simply present himself as the only threat, luring the Fang army into a specific valley or plain. It was the classic role of the anvil. Fu Hao played the role of the hammer. She took her elite forces, likely the chariots and the most disciplined infantry, and moved them in secret, under the cover of darkness or terrain, to a pre-arranged ambush site on the enemy's flank. This required her to keep thousands of men silent, to navigate without being spotted by enemy scouts, and to wait for the exact moment the trap was sprung. For hours, perhaps days, she lay in wait. This period of the gathering storm is the true test of a commander's nerve. The risk was catastrophic. If she attacked too early, the enemy would escape. If she attacked too late, her husband's army might be overrun and slaughtered. The fate of the dynasty rested on her timing. As she watched from the ridges, gripping her bronze axe, she would have seen the dust cloud of the Fang army engaging the king's forces. She would have heard the screams of the dying and the clash of bronze. Most commanders would have rushed in immediately. But Fu Hao waited. She waited until the Fang were fully committed, until their lines were stretched and their backs were turned to her hiding place. She was waiting for the perfect window of opportunity, the moment of maximum vulnerability. This was the difference between a skirmish and an annihilation. The Shang military machine, often rigid and ritualistic, was about to display a level of tactical flexibility that was centuries ahead of its time. The trap was set. The hammer was raised. And when Fu Hao finally gave the signal to charge, she unleashed a storm of violence that would break the back of the enemy coalition forever. When the signal finally came, perhaps the sounding of a massive bronze drum or the raising of a banner from the king's position, Fu Hao did not hesitate. The gathering storm broke with the fury of a landslide. The oracle bones simply state the result. The two Fang were defeated. But to understand the weight of that sentence, we must visualize the moment the trap was sprung. From the concealed ridges, Fu Hao's chariots thundered down into the valley. A Shang war chariot, at full gallop, is a terrifying engine of kinetic energy. The rumble of thousands of wooden wheels and the pounding of hooves would have created a low-frequency roar that was felt in the chest before it was heard by the ear. For the Fang and Fang forces, who were already locked in combat with King Wu Ding's front line, this sound was the death knell. They turned to see a second army, fresh, disciplined, and led by the queen herself, crashing into their exposed flank. The impact was catastrophic. The enemy formation didn't just break, it shattered. Fu Hao's charioteers drove deep wedges into the disorganized tribal mass, their archers raining arrows from point-blank range, while the spearmen on the chariots skewered anyone who tried to stand their ground. This was the hammer and anvil strategy executed to perfection. King Wu Ding was the anvil, holding the enemy in place, absorbing their blows. Fu Hao was the hammer, swinging down with crushing, unstoppable force. In the center of the chaos stood Fu Hao. We must imagine her not as a distant observer, but as a participant. The massive Yue axes found in her tomb were not ceremonial props. They were sharpened for use. In the swirl of dust and blood commanding from her chariot, she would have been the focal point of the battle. She was the avatar of the dynasty's wrath. Every enemy soldier cut down by her forces was not just a battlefield casualty. In the Shang worldview, they were an offering to the ancestors. The violence was brutal, intimate, and absolute. The result of the ambush was the complete encirclement and annihilation of the enemy force. It was the most decisive victory the Shang had achieved in generations. The two Fang, who had plagued the northern borders for decades, were broken. They would never again pose an existential threat to the Shang state during Wu Ding's reign. The oracle bones record the king's jubilation. He didn't just welcome her back. He rode out of the city to meet her, a breach of protocol that signals the immense magnitude of her achievement. But the defeat of the two Fang was only the beginning. Having proven her tactical genius, Fu Hao was unleashed upon the other enemies of the state. She became the fire that cleared the brush around the empire. She turned her gaze west toward the Qiang. The campaign against the Qiang was of a different nature entirely. The Qiang were a powerful, populous tribal confederation in the northwest. Fighting them wasn't just about border security. It was about expansion and resources. This campaign would become the defining military operation of Fu Hao's life, a massive, sustained offensive that required her to keep an army of 13,000 in the field for months. The logistics alone were a nightmare. Moving deep into hostile territory, she had to secure supply lines that stretched hundreds of miles back to Anyang. She had to navigate terrain that rendered her chariots less effective, forcing her to rely on heavy infantry tactics. Yet, the records show she did not falter. She adapted. She ground the Qiang down in a series of brutal engagements that displayed her relentless drive. The scale of her victory against the Qiang is terrifying. The oracle bones mention the capture of prisoners in numbers that were previously unimaginable. Fu Hao captures Qiang. This phrase appears repeatedly. In the Shang Dynasty, prisoners of war were not ransomed. They were the most valuable commodity in the empire. They were the fuel for the state religion. The Shang believed that the favor of the gods was purchased with blood. Captives from the Qiang tribes were brought back to Anyang by the thousands to be sacrificed in the royal tombs and temples. When we look at Fu Hao, we must accept this dark reality. She was a hero to her people, a protector of her civilization, but to her enemies, she was the harvester. She was the one who filled the sacrificial pits. The massive numbers of skeletal remains found in the sacrificial pits of Yinshu, many showing signs of violent execution, are the silent testament to the effectiveness of her Western campaigns. Her military career culminated in a total dominance of the Shang periphery. She fought in the north against the Tu Fang, in the west against the Qiang, and in the southeast against the Yi. The Yi campaign demonstrated her incredible versatility. The southeast was a land of marshes and rivers, entirely unsuited for the chariot warfare of the northern plains. Yet, Fu Hao successfully led a campaign there as well, proving she could master any terrain. By the height of her power, Fu Hao was, without question, the most powerful military figure in China. She had eclipsed every male general in the king's service. Her return to the capital after the Qiang campaign would have been a spectacle of imperial grandeur. Imagine the scene, the triumphant entry into Anyang, the streets lined with citizens cheering the woman who had secured their safety, the long lines of bound captives shuffling behind her chariot, and the spoils of war, bronze, jade, and horses, piled high on wagons. She had done what no woman and few men had ever done. She had secured the borders of the Middle Kingdom through sheer force of will. She stood at the pinnacle of Shang society, equal to the king in power, prestige, and spiritual authority. The warrior queen was no longer just a title. It was a reality forged in iron and blood. But the tragedy of the ancient world is that death often comes not from the enemy's sword, but from the frailty of the human body. Fu Hao had survived the arrows of the Tu Fang and the spears of the Qiang. She had survived the rigors of campaign life and the burden of command. But she could not survive the silent, invisible enemies that stalked the Bronze Age. Just as her legend reached its zenith, the fire that burned so brightly was about to be extinguished. The general had won the war, but she was about to face a battle she could not win. The end of Fu Hao's life came not with the roar of battle, but with the quiet, agonizing fade of illness. The oracle bones, which had so triumphantly recorded her victories, suddenly turned somber. The questions King Wuding asked the spirits shift from "will she win" to "will she survive?" Inscriptions reveal a desperate monarch pleading for the health of his wife. Fu Hao is ill. Will she recover? Has an evil wind struck Fu Hao? Despite the prayers, the sacrifices, and the best medical knowledge of the Shang court, the warrior queen could not be saved. Historians estimate she was only 33 years old when she died. The cause was likely exhaustion, compounded by the strain of her final campaigns and the toll of multiple childbirths. Her life had been a blazing comet, brilliant, terrifying, and all too brief. She had burned the candle at both ends, serving as the state's leading general and its high priestess, bearing the weight of the empire on her shoulders until they finally collapsed. The grief of King Wuding was profound and unprecedented. In a society where women were often interchangeable political pawns, Wuding's reaction to Fu Hao's death reveals a deep, personal loss. He did not simply bury her and move on to the next consort. He broke with royal tradition in a way that would preserve her legacy for 3,000 years. Instead of burying her in the official royal cemetery at Shibeigang, across the river where the other kings and queens rested, Wuding ordered her tomb to be constructed directly beside his own palace in the capital city of Yinshu. He wanted her close. He wanted her spirit to remain within the walls of the city she had defended. This decision, born of grief and affection, was the single most important factor in the preservation of her history. When the royal cemetery was looted and plundered by grave robbers over the ensuing centuries, the isolated, unmarked tomb of Fu Hao sat quietly under the foundations of the palace, unnoticed and undisturbed. The contents of tomb number 5, excavated in 1976, serve as the final inventory of her power. The wealth buried with her was staggering. Archaeologists cataloged 468 bronze objects, more than any other Shang tomb ever discovered. Among them were the massive ritual vessels used for feasting, bells for music, and mirrors for divination. There were 755 exquisite jade carvings, ancient heirlooms even at the time of her burial, collected from eras past. There were nearly 7,000 cowrie shells, the hard currency of the Shang, indicating she possessed immense personal fortune. But the most telling items were the weapons. She was buried with over 130 weapons of war. The great bronze yue axes were placed near her body, not as symbolic gestures, but as functional tools for the afterlife. Wu Ding was sending her into the next world fully armed. He believed that even in death, she would need to fight. He believed she would continue to protect the Shang state from the spirits of their enemies. The king's devotion went even further. In a ritual that seems strange to modern sensibilities, but was deeply logical to the Shang mind, Wu Ding performed spirit marriages for his deceased wife. Worried that she would be lonely or vulnerable in the afterlife, he formally married her spirit to the three greatest kings of the Shang Dynasty who had come before him, Dajia, Chengtang, and Xiao Yi. In the king's eyes, Fu Hao was too great to be merely a consort in death. She needed to be the peer of the founding emperors. He entrusted her soul to the titans of history, ensuring she would hold a rank in the underworld equal to the one she held on earth. For a time, her spirit was honored with sacrifices usually reserved only for kings. But as the centuries passed, the Shang Dynasty fell. It was replaced by the Zhou, and then the Qin, and the Han. The culture of China shifted. The raw, shamanistic equality of the Bronze Age gave way to the rigid, patriarchal structures of Confucianism. In this new world order, the idea of a woman leading armies, conducting sacrifices, and owning land was considered unnatural, even dangerous. The Confucian historians who compiled the official records sanitized the past. They wrote of King Wu Ding's wisdom and his revival of the dynasty, but they erased the woman who made it possible. Fu Hao was forgotten. Her name disappeared from the bamboo scrolls. For 3,000 years, she existed only as a silent ghost beneath the earth, while the civilization she helped build forgot she ever existed. It was not until the 20th century, when the oracle bones were deciphered and her tomb was finally opened, that the truth rushed back into the light. The discovery of Fu Hao was a shock to the system of traditional history. She proved that the subjugation of women in Chinese history was not eternal or inevitable. She proved that at the very root of the civilization, a woman had stood at the apex of power, commanding respect not for her beauty or her silence, but for her ability to wage war and govern men. Today, a statue of Fu Hao stands in Yinshu. She is depicted in armor, holding her battle axe, looking out over the land she once defended. She is no longer just a footnote in King Wu Ding's reign. She is recognized as the first general. Her story is a testament to the fact that while history books can be rewritten to suit the politics of the present, the truth, buried in bronze and bone, eventually fights its way to the surface. Fu Hao's life forces us to ask, how many other women have been erased? How many other generals, strategists, and leaders have been lost to the silence of the archives? She reminds us that the history of war is not a history of men. It is a history of power, and power has never been the exclusive domain of a single gender. Her vengeance against the Tu Fang and the Qiang secured the survival of the Shang, but her greatest victory was against time itself. By commanding the respect of her king and the fear of her enemies, she carved her name so deep into the bedrock of history that even 3 millennia of silence could not wear it away. She was Fu Hao, mother, priestess, general, queen. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the life of China's first female general, please subscribe to Women at War. We are building a library of the most formidable women in military history, and we don't want you to miss the next episode. Next week, we travel to the sands of Syria to meet Zenobia, the queen who defied the Roman legions and declared herself empress. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you on the next battlefield.